I'm Pastor Mike, and I recently put out a video where I talked about uh, what I call the state of Adventist theology. So in this graphic, I explained that the majority of people within the Adventist church, as far as I can tell, fall into one of these three categories. Either they're in a state of blissful ignorance regarding Adventist theology, in the sense that, sure, they have some understanding of Adventist theology, but they haven't advanced far enough to really have a full picture of all the potential problems, all the potential issues, all the objections people have raised over the decades and 150 years or more that we've been around to our way of thinking. They don't fully understand the rest of Christian theologies to kind of see where we conflict with other people and why. So they're in a state of ignorance regarding all these problems, and they think everything's fine. Now, as people develop in theological education, they go to school, they pick up books and read and learn things. They often come to a point of crisis where they begin to question things and they begin to wonder, hey, could it be wrong? Could I have made a mistake here or there in different areas of our theology? And as a result of this crisis, people usually take one or two possible turns. One is they become dogmatic about our theology. So they say, yeah, there's all these problems, but I think the solutions are there. We don't need to worry about it. And then they move on. So they just sort of dismiss the problems. They come up with simplistic solutions. They ignore them and they go on to other things. And they just continue to believe whatever they want to believe in spite of these issues. While other people cannot do that, and they just come to the conclusion, hey, there is no solution to some of these problems, and they give up and they turn over to other ways of thinking. So they adopt the theology of other denominations, other systems of thought that are not really compatible with our theology. Virtually the vast majority, pretty much, I don't know what I would say, 95% of Adventists fall into one of these three categories. There's a very small percentage of people over the past few decades who come to this point of crisis, and instead of either becoming dogmatic or giving up, they actually press forward and try to come up with real solutions, and they eventually find answers really slowly because there's so few of them, and often they don't know about each other. They're not really connected, and the progress is really slow. In spite of this, I made the statement in the previous video that I believe we can take all the objections against Adventist theology and break them down into two categories. One would be the traditionalist category, and the other one, the modernist. Now, the modernist category has to do with objections that come from science, whether it's things like the theory of evolution or things like critical scholarship, higher criticism, however you want to call it. Those are science-based objections. So that's one line of objections against Adventism. The traditionalist objections have more to do with theology, with exegesis, with tradition, with soteriology, Protestantism, and where we fit in Protestantism in general, and things like that. From where I stand, and in my opinion, I believe any of the traditionalist objections to Adventism have been dealt with, have been resolved, even though the majority of people are not aware they have. So people continue to bring objections against Adventist theology from that traditionalist perspective, but the church already has solutions to those. The modernist perspectives I mentioned, so any objections that come that are from the science side of things, we really have no real solutions to that, and we have a lot of work to do as Adventists in that area. So I want to do a series of videos where I explain why I believe we're not really anywhere near where we need to be when it comes to addressing the modernist objections. And I mentioned in the previous video that I believe one of the biggest problems is that we need people with advanced education in three vastly different fields. One is science, one is theology, and one is philosophy. We need people that have PhDs in all those three areas so that they can have a firm grasp of how these different fields, they have very different rational structures. The way people think when they immerse themselves in those fields is very different from one to the other. And the people that need to work in this area and need to come up with solutions to some of the problems we have regarding the conflicts between Adventism and science, need to have a firm understanding of all those three fields at a very advanced level. And I want to take some time and do a series of videos where I try to explain why I think we need people to have a deep understanding of these areas, and we probably don't have them. It takes forever to get a PhD, and getting a PhD in three very distinct areas is very difficult. Now, I'm not saying that's a requirement, but we need people at that level of expertise in these vastly different fields for us to really figure out solutions to some of these problems. Okay, so for the next few videos, I'm going to focus on that. Now, with that being said, I realize that there's some people that will say, hey, wait a minute, don't just jump to the modernist side. There's still a lot of objection on the traditionalist side, and just because you say they've been solved doesn't mean they've actually been solved. And the other question is, how would we even determine if they've been solved or not? I mean, just because you think they're solved doesn't mean they've actually been resolved. So what I would say to those people is that there are probably hundreds of possible objections that people can bring up. And I don't have time to go through each and every one of them. So if somebody has something specific, I'm more than willing to do a video on that and explain why I think that particular problem has been dealt with. But before I do that, I want to present a format for evaluation, because we got to ask ourselves, how do we decide if a problem has been dealt with or not? And I want to propose this particular thought process to how to think about, whether some objection is legitimate, whether it has been dealt with, and can we move on and say that we have actually resolved that problem. If we look at Christian theology as a whole, so there's 2.5 billion Christians in the world. There are hundreds, possibly thousands, maybe tens of thousands of different denominations or points of view, tradition, things like that. So there's so many different perspectives out there. Now, if we thought about them carefully, if we examine all these points of view, we could probably bring them together into theological families or theological traditions and narrow it down to, let's just say, about a dozen different distinct points of view. You could, some things are obvious, like, there's Catholicism, there's Eastern Orthodoxy, and there's Protestantism, but Protestantism has a wide variety of different approaches, and then there's liberal Protestantism, and then there's hybrids and all this stuff. So there's many different perspectives that we could probably boil down to, say, 10, 12, something like that, different approaches to theology. Now, what I contend in this whole discussion is that Adventism needs to be treated as its own unique approach. People tend to mash Adventism together with some other tradition, and we need to be dealt with as a separate thing because we have a very different approach to theology. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is that if we're going to evaluate the Adventist approach to theology, we need to think of it like this. We need to acknowledge the fact that there's many different views out there. There's many different traditions, many different systems of thought in Christian theology. And if somebody's going to critique Adventism, they should at least, before we start, point to a handful of other tradition which they consider legitimate. Okay, so before coming to critique our point of view, they should say, okay, here's, let's say 10 or 15 possible approaches. We consider this one, and this one to be legitimate approaches at least. Okay, so for Adventism to qualify as a legitimate approach, it needs to reach at least this level of intelligibility, at least this level of rationality, or however you want to judge it, by comparing it to this 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever it is, other approaches that are legitimate. And why do I say that? Because if somebody cannot look at the vast landscape of Christian theology and point to at least a handful of perspectives that they think are legitimate perspectives, essentially what they're saying is that, hey, my own perspective is the only legitimate one, is the only one that's correct, and everybody else is wrong. So the problem is not actually with Adventist theology. The problem is with everybody that disagrees with them, okay? So it is not fair to then say, hey, there's all these issues with Adventist theology, when in fact, they disagree with everybody, not just us, right? So if they want to evaluate Adventism, they should say, okay, here's a few different approaches. Here's why we consider these approaches legitimate. And then when we look at Adventism, what we need to say is, can Adventism measure up to the same level as these approaches, because all the different theological approaches in Christianity have their problems. Okay, so you cannot hold up Adventism to some perfect standard and say, unless Adventism resolves all its issues to such a level that there isn't a single imaginable objection left, then Adventism is wrong. No, because none of the other perspectives meet that standard. Okay, so if we're going to evaluate Adventism, let's put it side by side with other theological perspectives, and let's see if it measures up to them. Now, obviously, not all of these perspectives can be sound. You know, some of them, like for example, say Mormonism. Mormonism is a relatively unique point of view in Christian theology, but it's not a perspective that we could probably take seriously in an academic setting or whatever other setting we want to judge theology by. So we could dismiss that and say, okay, that one doesn't fit, but there's other perspectives that do make sense, and they do make legitimate points and so on. So if we could do that, then we can have a conversation about Adventist theology. And it doesn't have to be subjective. It doesn't have to be, well, my opinion is that you guys have these problems and you haven't solved them, and your opinion is that you did solve them, and there's no way to decide who's right or wrong. No, we could actually get a third party jury put together. So in other words, we could get people that have no stake in any of these other traditions. They might belong to a completely different perspective in Christianity. They might not have been Christian. They might be atheists, whatever. And we could set them on the side and say, okay, these are our standard perspectives that we're using to judge things by. This is the degree, this is the kind of problems they have and the degree to which they were able to solve these problems. Do you guys feel that Adventism is capable of reaching that particular level? Like, has it been able to address its problems to the same degree that some of these other perspectives have? And unbiased third parties could look at it and say, yeah, it seems like they've done the work, and they could measure up to the same degree as these other perspectives that we're looking at. And we can actually have an objective system of evaluation, as opposed to people just making up their mind that we're wrong and they're right, and they know better and all this stuff. And at the same time, it doesn't get left up to me to say, well, we've solved the problems, we don't need to worry about them either. So again, what I'm saying here applies to the traditionalist views or the traditionalist objections. The modernist objections, I fully acknowledge that we have a lot of work to do left. And what I'm going to spend my time on is presenting a possible pathway to address those objections, even though they have not yet been addressed. Okay, so I'm fully acknowledging that we have a lot of issues to resolve in that area. All this other stuff that is not necessarily related to science, I believe has been dealt with. And this is a method or a process that we can use to determine if, in fact, Adventism has truly addressed these issues or not.